The CNN studio lights blazed with an intensity that seemed to mirror the tension crackling through the air. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly composed across from Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders, her dark eyes focused with the laser precision of someone who'd spent countless hours in federal courtrooms. What started as Anderson Cooper's routine Friday night political discussion was about to explode into the most viral political moment of the year, a moment that would fundamentally change how America viewed both women. Sanders, radiating the confidence that came from her years defending Donald Trump at White House podiums, had just made a sweeping statement about constitutional law that revealed a shocking gap in her legal knowledge. The former press secretary, now sitting governor, had no idea she was about to face someone whose constitutional expertise would expose her claims as dangerously uninformed. But Crockett, armed with 15 years of civil rights litigation and a razor-sharp legal mind, was ready to deliver a constitutional education that would leave millions of viewers speechless and legal scholars applauding. The studio's atmosphere was electric. Camera operators sensed something brewing as they captured the subtle tension between the two women. Sanders leaning back with political confidence, Crockett sitting forward with the focused intensity of an attorney about to cross-examine a hostile witness. Even the production crew seemed to recognize they were about to witness something extraordinary. What happened in the next 30 seconds didn't just embarrass a sitting governor on national television. It exposed a fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional law that shocked legal experts from Harvard to Yale. The clip would break the internet within hours, generating over 50 million views across platforms as Crockett School's Sanders trended globally. Viewers worldwide watched in amazement as a former Trump press secretary got completely dismantled by a Texas civil rights lawyer turned congresswoman who wielded constitutional law like a surgical instrument. The moment would be studied in law schools, celebrated by civil rights organizations, and turned into countless memes. Legal scholars would call it the most devastating constitutional takedown in cable news history, while political commentators struggled to find adequate comparisons for the systematic destruction they'd witnessed. Before we dive into this epic constitutional showdown that changed American political discourse, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these incredible political moments that define our democracy. Comment where you're watching from. We love hearing from our international viewers who appreciate American political drama. Ring that notification bell because moments like these don't happen often, but when they do, they're absolutely unmissable. Now, let's see exactly how Jasmine Crockett just rewrote the rules of political debate and delivered a masterclass in constitutional law that will be remembered for decades. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two powerhouses are and why their clash was inevitable. Jasmine Crockett represents everything the new Democratic Party stands for. At 43, she's a former civil rights attorney from Dallas who made her name defending ordinary Americans against powerful interests. Before Congress, she spent years in courtrooms fighting for voting rights, workers' compensation, and criminal justice reform. Her legal mind is sharp as a blade, and she doesn't back down from anyone. Not judges, not opposing counsel, and definitely not politicians who think they can intimidate her. Crockett rose through Texas politics like a rocket, but her journey wasn't typical political ambition. It was driven by a deep commitment to constitutional justice. She started in the state legislature, where she quickly gained attention for her fierce questioning during committee hearings. But what really set her apart was her ability to cite specific constitutional provisions from memory, often catching seasoned politicians off guard with her legal precision. Her reputation for constitutional expertise grew rapidly. Legal scholars from the University of Texas and Southern Methodist University began noting her remarkable ability to cut through political nonsense with hard constitutional facts. During one particularly memorable Texas legislative session, she systematically dismantled a voter suppression bill by citing 14 separate Supreme Court cases, leaving its sponsors speechless and ultimately forcing them to withdraw the legislation. When she ran for Congress, she promised voters she'd bring that same courtroom energy and constitutional knowledge to Washington. Her campaign ads featured her arguing cases in federal court, with the tagline, "Send a lawyer to do a lawyer's job." Texas voters responded overwhelmingly, electing her by the largest margin in her district's history. She delivered on every promise, quickly establishing herself as the House Democrats' constitutional conscience. Her legal background isn't just impressive, It's specifically relevant to the kinds of constitutional battles playing out in American politics today. She's argued voting rights cases, defended civil liberties, and successfully challenged state laws that violated federal constitutional protections. This isn't theoretical knowledge. It's hard-won expertise from actual courtroom victories. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, on the other hand, represents the Trump-era Republican establishment in its purest form. The 41-year-old daughter of former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, she was practically born into conservative politics. Her father's presidential campaigns gave her early exposure to national politics, but it was her role as Donald Trump's press secretary that truly defined her public persona. For nearly 2 years, she stood behind that White House podium defending the most controversial presidency in modern American history. Day after day, she faced hostile questions from the press corps, developing a reputation for fierce loyalty and absolutely ruthless defense of Trump's agenda. Her ability to deflect, redirect, and attack critics made her a conservative hero and liberal target. But here's what many people don't realize about Sanders' background. She has zero legal training. Her expertise is purely political and media-focused. She understands messaging, spin, and public relations, but constitutional law is completely outside her wheelhouse. This wouldn't matter for most political positions, but as governor, she's responsible for state policies that must comply with federal constitutional requirements. After leaving the White House amid controversy over her credibility with reporters, Sanders leveraged her Trump connection into a successful gubernatorial campaign in Arkansas. She won in a massive landslide, carrying Trump's endorsement and promising to bring conservative values to state government. Her victory was seen as validation of the Trump approach to politics, aggressive, unapologetic, and dismissive of traditional norms. As governor, she's pushed through some of the most aggressive conservative legislation in the country, from dramatic education reforms to voting law changes that civil rights groups immediately labeled as discriminatory. She's also passed laws restricting reproductive rights, limiting LGBTQ+ protections, and reducing oversight of business practices. Critics argue many of these laws clearly violate federal constitutional protections, but Sanders has dismissed such concerns as liberal fear-mongering. But here's where the stakes get really interesting. Sanders hasn't just been governing Arkansas. She's been positioning herself as a potential future presidential candidate. She's used her governor's office to build national conservative credibility, appearing on Fox News regularly and speaking at major conservative conferences. Her message is simple. She successfully implemented Trump's agenda at the state level and could do the same nationally. This national ambition makes her constitutional knowledge, or lack thereof, particularly important. Presidential candidates are expected to understand the Constitution they'd swear to protect and defend. Legal experts have been quietly questioning some of Sanders' policies for months, suggesting they might not survive constitutional challenges, but she's dismissed these concerns as partisan attacks. This CNN appearance was supposed to be Sanders' moment to shine on the national stage, demonstrating her policy expertise to a broader audience. The topic was perfect for her brand, state versus federal authority, a classic conservative theme. Sanders came prepared with polling-tested talking points about states' rights and federal overreach, confident in her ability to handle whatever questions Anderson Cooper might ask. What she didn't expect was facing Jasmine Crockett, whose constitutional litigation experience and legal expertise would turn this friendly TV segment into a legal masterclass that would humiliate Sanders in front of millions of viewers and constitutional law experts. The contrast couldn't be starker. A trained lawyer with years of constitutional litigation experience versus a political operative with media training, but no legal background. Sanders was about to learn the hard way that politics and law are very different games. The CNN segment started innocently enough. Host Anderson Cooper introduced both women, setting up what he expected to be a standard political debate about federal versus state authority. The topic was timely. Several Republican governors had been challenging federal policies, claiming states' rights protections under the Constitution. Sanders spoke first, and her confidence was immediately apparent. Sitting straight in her chair, wearing a sharp navy blazer, she launched into her prepared talking points with the polish of someone who'd spent years at White House podiums. Anderson, what we're seeing from this administration is a complete disregard for the 10th Amendment, Sanders began, her Arkansas accent carrying the authority she'd cultivated as governor. The Constitution is crystal clear. Powers not specifically given to the federal government belong to the states. That's Federalism 101. She warmed to her theme, gesturing with the conviction of someone who believed every word. In Arkansas, we've passed common-sense legislation to protect our citizens from federal overreach. When Washington tries to impose one-size-fits-all solutions on states like Arkansas, we push back. That's not just our right. It's our constitutional duty. Cooper nodded, then turned to Crockett. Congresswoman, your response? Crockett's demeanor was noticeably different. Where Sanders projected political confidence, Crockett radiated legal precision. She sat forward slightly, her hands clasped, dark eyes focused with the intensity of someone who'd spent years in courtrooms where facts matter more than talking points. Anderson, I appreciate Governor Sanders's passion, Crockett began, her Texas accent carrying a different kind of authority, the weight of legal training. But I think there might be some confusion about what the Constitution actually says versus what some politicians wish it said. The first hint of tension appeared on Sanders's face. A slight tightening around her eyes suggested she hadn't expected this level of pushback. Crockett continued, her voice steady but firm. The 10th Amendment doesn't give states unlimited power to ignore federal law. The Supremacy Clause in Article 6 makes federal law supreme when Congress acts within its constitutional authority. Governor Sanders is talking about nullification theory, which was settled in the 1800s. Sanders's media training kicked in immediately. She'd dealt with hostile questions before, and she wasn't about to let a freshman congresswoman lecture her on national television. Congresswoman Crockett, with all due respect, I think you're mischaracterizing Arkansas's position, Sanders shot back, her voice carrying the edge she'd developed during combative White House briefings. We're not talking about nullification. We're talking about legitimate state sovereignty under our federal system. But Crockett wasn't backing down. If anything, Sanders' defensive tone seemed to energize her. Governor, I'd be happy to discuss state sovereignty, Crockett replied, pulling out her phone. But let's talk about specific examples. Your state just passed legislation that directly contradicts federal civil rights protections. That's not state sovereignty. That's constitutional violation. The studio atmosphere shifted. Cooper sensed the tension escalating and leaned forward, recognizing this was becoming something more than a standard political discussion. Sanders's face flushed slightly. She wasn't used to being challenged on legal grounds, especially not by someone citing specific constitutional provisions. I think you're overstepping your bounds here, Congresswoman. As a sitting governor, I think I understand state authority better than someone who's been in Congress for less than 2 years. That's when Crockett's legal training fully kicked in. In courtrooms, when opposing counsel got personal instead of addressing the law, it usually meant they were losing the argument. Governor Sanders, this isn't about experience, it's about constitutional law, Crockett said, her voice taking on the precise tone of a lawyer addressing a judge. And since you brought up qualifications, I spent 15 years practicing constitutional law before entering Congress. I've actually argued these cases in federal court. The dig was subtle but devastating. Sanders realized she'd walked into a trap, challenging the legal credentials of an actual lawyer while having none herself. Cooper, sensing the moment, jumped in. Governor Sanders, Congresswoman Crockett raises an interesting point about federal supremacy. How do you respond to the legal argument? Sanders tried to regain her footing, falling back on political rhetoric. Look, Anderson, this is exactly the kind of elitist attitude we see from Washington. They think they know better than state governments, better than the people who elected us. But Crockett wasn't letting her escape into political talking points. Governor, respectfully, this isn't about elitism, Crockett interjected, her legal training taking over completely. This is about the Constitution. You can't just cite the 10th Amendment while ignoring the Supremacy Clause, the Commerce Clause, and the 14th Amendment. Constitutional law doesn't work that way. The escalation was building toward something explosive. Sanders looked increasingly uncomfortable, realizing she was in a legal debate she wasn't equipped to handle. Crockett, meanwhile, was just getting started. In fact, Governor, some of Arkansas's recent legislation appears to violate multiple constitutional provisions. Have your legal advisors explained the likely federal court challenges? Sanders' response would prove to be the mistake that turned this segment into a viral moment. Instead of acknowledging the legal complexity or deferring to constitutional experts, she doubled down with pure political bluster. "Congresswoman, I don't need lectures from Washington politicians about what Arkansas can and can't do. We know our rights and we're going to defend them." Crockett paused for just a moment, and anyone familiar with courtroom dynamics recognized the pause. It was the moment when a skilled lawyer realized their opponent had just made a fatal error. "Governor Sanders," Crockett said, her voice now carrying the full authority of her legal background. "With respect, it's becoming clear that you don't actually understand the law you're trying to defend." The studio fell silent. Even Cooper seemed stunned by the directness of the statement. Sanders's face went from flushed to pale as she realized she'd been backed into a corner by someone who actually knew constitutional law inside and out. The stage was set for what would become one of the most devastating legal takedowns in cable news history. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media, studied in law schools, and cited by constitutional scholars as a perfect example of why legal expertise matters in political debates. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her legal instincts fully engaged. In courtrooms, when opposing counsel made unsupported claims about the law, she'd learned to strike fast and with precision. This moment was no different. "Governor Sanders, since you keep citing state authority, let me ask you a specific question," Crockett began, her voice carrying the measured tone of a lawyer examining a witness. "Under what constitutional provision does Arkansas claim the right to override federal civil rights protections?" Sanders blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct legal question. Her media training had prepared her for political attacks, not constitutional law examinations. "Well, the 10th Amendment clearly states," Sanders began, but Crockett cut her off with surgical precision. "The 10th Amendment reserves powers to states that aren't specifically granted to the federal government," Crockett interrupted. "But civil rights fall under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and Congress's enforcement powers. Those are explicitly federal. So which constitutional provision are you claiming overrides federal civil rights law?" The silence in the studio was deafening. Sanders's face showed the exact moment she realized she was completely out of her legal depth. She tried to recover with political rhetoric. "Look, this is exactly the kind of legal gymnastics that Washington uses to—" "Governor, this isn't gymnastics," Crockett interrupted again, her voice now carrying the full weight of her courtroom experience. "This is basic constitutional law, the kind they teach in first-year law school." Cooper watched in fascination as the exchange unfolded. This wasn't typical political theater. This was a legal expert systematically dismantling someone who'd overestimated their constitutional knowledge. But Crockett wasn't finished. She'd identified Sanders' fundamental weakness and was about to exploit it completely. "Let me make this even simpler, Governor," Crockett continued, pulling out her phone. "I'm looking at Arkansas Act 1002, which your administration signed last month. Section 3 directly contradicts the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Section 7 violates the Voting Rights Act, and Section 12 appears to ignore Supreme Court precedent from Brown v. Board." Sanders' media training was failing her completely. She'd never faced this kind of detailed legal challenge, and her usual deflection tactics weren't working. Our legal team reviewed that legislation thoroughly," Sanders stammered, her confidence evaporating. "Did they?" Crockett asked, her eyebrows raised. "Because any first-year law student could spot these constitutional violations. Did your legal team explain that this law will likely be struck down in federal court within 6 months?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Sanders looked around the studio as if searching for help that wasn't coming. "Our legal team is confident in Arkansas law," Sanders replied weakly, but her voice lacked any conviction. That's when Crockett delivered the knockout punch. "Governor Sanders," she said, her voice now carrying the full authority of someone who'd spent years defending constitutional rights, "I don't think you understand what you just said. You're claiming confidence in a law that violates multiple constitutional provisions. That's not state sovereignty. That's constitutional ignorance." The words hit like a thunderbolt. Sanders's face went white as she realized she'd been completely exposed on national television. "Furthermore," Crockett continued, clearly not done, "your claim about the 10th Amendment shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how federalism actually works. The Constitution isn't a buffet where states can pick and choose which federal laws to follow. Cooper leaned forward, recognizing he was witnessing something extraordinary. Congresswoman, you're essentially saying Governor Sanders doesn't understand constitutional law? Crockett turned to Cooper, then back to Sanders, her expression serious but not cruel. Anderson, I'm saying that Governor Sanders appears to be confused about basic constitutional principles, and that's dangerous when you're responsible for state policy that affects millions of people. Sanders tried one last desperate political attack, her voice rising with the defensive tone of someone who knew they were drowning. This is exactly the kind of condescending attitude that Washington elite use to silence everyday Americans and their elected representatives. Governor, Crockett interrupted, her patience clearly exhausted and her legal training taking complete control. You don't know the law. You've spent this entire segment making demonstrably false claims about constitutional authority while citing legal provisions that don't remotely support your position. That's not condescending. That's factual. And it's dangerous when you're responsible for state policy that affects millions of Arkansas citizens. The words hung in the studio air like a death sentence. Sanders's face went through a visible transformation, from defensive anger to pale recognition that she'd been utterly destroyed on national television by someone who actually understood the legal principles she'd been carelessly misrepresenting. Cooper, recognizing the magnitude of what had just occurred, leaned forward with the instincts of a veteran journalist who knew he'd just witnessed something historic. The silence in the studio was so complete that viewers could almost hear the cameras clicking as they captured Sanders' humiliation. But Crockett wasn't finished delivering her constitutional lesson. She sensed Sanders' complete legal defeat and moved in for the educational kill that would cement this moment in political history. Furthermore, Governor Sanders, your repeated claims about Arkansas sovereignty reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of how constitutional federalism actually operates, Crockett continued, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of a law professor addressing a failing student. The Constitution isn't a cafeteria where states can pick and choose which federal laws to follow based on political preferences. The Supremacy Clause exists specifically to prevent exactly the kind of selective constitutional compliance you're advocating. Sanders opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, completely out of her depth, and clearly recognizing that every word she might say would only dig her hole deeper. Cooper, sensing the historic nature of the moment, asked the question that would become the most quoted part of the entire exchange. Congresswoman Crockett, are you essentially telling a sitting governor that she doesn't understand the Constitution she swore to uphold? Crockett turned to Cooper, then back to Sanders, her expression serious but not cruel, more like a teacher disappointed by a student's failure to grasp basic concepts. Anderson, I'm stating a demonstrable fact based on Governor Sanders' own words during this segment. She has repeatedly made claims about constitutional law that are simply incorrect. When public officials misunderstand the Constitution they've sworn to defend, that's not a political disagreement. That's a civic crisis that affects every citizen under their authority. Sanders managed only the weakest of responses. I stand by Arkansas law and our constitutional rights as a sovereign state. Even this final attempt at deflection revealed her continued constitutional confusion, as any first-year law student could explain that states aren't sovereign in the way Sanders suggested. They're part of a federal constitutional system with clearly defined limitations on state authority. Crockett's response was devastating in its simplicity. She should listen to actual constitutional lawyers instead of political advisors. Because right now, Arkansas taxpayers are going to pay millions in legal fees defending unconstitutional laws that any competent attorney could have warned her about. Sanders looked like she wanted to disappear. The confident governor who'd entered the studio had been replaced by someone who clearly realized she'd been exposed as constitutionally illiterate on national television. Governor Sanders, any final response? Cooper asked, almost sympathetically. Sanders managed only a weak, I stand by Arkansas law, before the segment mercifully ended, but the damage was done. In 15 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had systematically destroyed Sarah Huckabee Sanders' constitutional arguments, exposed her legal ignorance, and delivered one of the most brutal political takedowns in cable news history. The legal community would spend weeks analyzing the exchange, with constitutional scholars praising Crockett's precision and criticizing Sanders' fundamental misunderstanding of federal law. The moment the CNN cameras stopped rolling, the internet exploded. Within minutes, clips of Jasmine Crockett's legal demolition of Sarah Huckabee Sanders were spreading across every social media platform like wildfire. The most viral moment, Crockett's devastating line, "You don't know the law," was clipped, memed, and shared millions of times. Crockett School's Sanders began trending on Twitter within 30 minutes, eventually reaching the top of trending topics worldwide. Legal Twitter erupted first. Constitutional law professors, civil rights attorneys, and federal judges who rarely engage in political social media began sharing the clips with commentary praising Crockett's precision. Professor Lawrence Tribe from Harvard Law School tweeted, "This is what happens when actual legal expertise meets political rhetoric." Rep. Jasmine Crockett just delivered a masterclass in constitutional law, required viewing for anyone who claims to understand federalism. The American Civil Liberties Union shared the clip with the comment, "When politicians claim constitutional authority they don't understand, this is why legal expertise matters." Brilliant breakdown by Representative Jasmine Crockett. Within hours, the clip had been viewed over 10 million times across platforms. The hashtag #YouDon'tKnowTheLaw became a rallying cry for legal professionals frustrated with politicians misrepresenting constitutional law. But the conservative response revealed deep fractures within the Republican legal community. While political allies rushed to defend Sanders with familiar talking points about elite condescension, conservative legal scholars found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't defend Sanders' constitutional arguments without compromising their own professional credibility. Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton tweeted, "Typical Washington lawyer looking down on elected governors. Sarah Huckabee stands for Arkansas values, not D.C. legal games." But his tweet was immediately challenged by conservative lawyers, who pointed out that constitutional law isn't a game. It's the foundation of American governance. The response from conservative legal organizations was particularly telling. The Federalist Society, typically quick to defend Republican officials, remained conspicuously silent for days. When they finally issued a statement, it was carefully worded to avoid endorsing Sanders's specific claims while defending the general principle of federalism. However, even some prominent conservative legal scholars couldn't defend Sanders' constitutional arguments. Federalist Society member Professor Stephen Calabrese wrote a detailed analysis. "While I disagree with Representative Crockett's politics, her constitutional analysis was legally sound. Governor Sanders' claims about the 10th Amendment were not just problematic. They reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how federalism actually works in our constitutional system." Josh Blackman, a conservative constitutional law professor known for defending Republican positions, was even more direct. "This exchange demonstrates why legal expertise matters in governance. You can't claim constitutional authority you don't understand. Sanders should have deferred to actual constitutional lawyers instead of making claims she couldn't support." The legal community's response was overwhelmingly supportive of Crockett's analysis. The American Bar Association shared the clip with commentary, noting how it demonstrated the importance of legal precision in public discourse. State bar associations began using it in continuing legal education programs about constitutional law. Law school admissions offices reported increased interest from prospective students inspired by Crockett's example. Several schools added the clip to their promotional materials, highlighting how legal education prepares graduates for public service. Constitutional law professors nationwide incorporated it into their curricula as a perfect example of legal analysis applied to political issues. The political implications became clear immediately and grew more significant over time. Sanders, who'd been quietly building a network of donors and political operatives for a potential 2028 presidential run, found her constitutional credentials in complete tatters. Political commentators began openly questioning whether her legal ignorance fundamentally disqualified her from higher office. CNN's legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin called it one of the most thorough legal demolitions I've ever witnessed on television. Crockett didn't just win a political argument. She exposed fundamental legal ignorance that should deeply concern Arkansas voters and anyone considering Sanders for national office. MSNBC's Ari Melber, himself a lawyer, devoted an entire segment to analyzing Crockett's technique. This is what happens when actual legal expertise meets political rhetoric. Crockett asked specific questions, demanded precise answers, and called out unsupported legal claims. Every law student should study this exchange. More damaging for Sanders were the immediate practical consequences that validated Crockett's legal analysis in real time. Within 48 hours, 3 separate federal lawsuits were filed challenging Arkansas legislation that Crockett had specifically criticized during the CNN segment. Civil rights organizations, including the American Civil Liberties Union and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, used Crockett's analysis in their legal briefs, essentially turning her television appearance into evidence of the state's knowing constitutional violations. The Southern Poverty Law Center filed the most comprehensive challenge, directly quoting Crockett's constitutional analysis in their complaint. As Representative Crockett correctly noted on national television, Arkansas Act 1002 violates multiple constitutional provisions, including the Equal Protection Clause and federal civil rights laws. The state's own governor's inability to defend these violations on constitutional grounds demonstrates their awareness of the law's illegality. The Arkansas Attorney General's office found itself in the deeply embarrassing position of defending laws that had been nationally criticized by a constitutional law expert on live television. Internal emails obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests later revealed that state lawyers had indeed warned the governor's office about constitutional problems with the legislation, but political advisors had overruled their legal concerns. One email from the state's chief legal counsel was particularly damning. These provisions clearly violate federal constitutional protections and will likely be struck down in federal court. We should reconsider this legislation. The response from Sanders' chief of staff was blunt. The governor wants to move forward regardless of legal concerns. For Crockett, the victory was transformative. Overnight, she became the Democratic Party's go-to voice on constitutional issues. Cable news producers began booking her for legal analysis segments. Law schools invited her to speak about the intersection of legal expertise and political service. House Democratic leadership took notice immediately. Within a week, Crockett was appointed to the House Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties. Speaker Hakeem Jeffries praised her exceptional legal mind and ability to articulate complex constitutional principles. The moment became even more significant when legal scholars began analyzing not just what Crockett said, but how she said it. Georgetown law professor Paul Butler noted, Crockett demonstrated perfect legal advocacy technique. She asked specific questions, demanded precise answers, cited exact legal authorities, and refused to let Sanders escape into political rhetoric. This is exactly how constitutional lawyers should engage with public officials who misrepresent the law. Harvard's Lawrence Tribe went further in his analysis. What made this exchange so powerful wasn't just Crockett's legal knowledge. It was her refusal to treat constitutional law as a matter of political opinion. She insisted on precision and accuracy, which exposed Sanders' fundamental confusion about basic constitutional principles. The clip became required viewing in law schools across the country, but not just for constitutional law classes. Communications professors used it to demonstrate effective legal advocacy, while political science departments analyzed it as an example of how expertise should inform public debate. Yale Law School added the exchange to their trial advocacy curriculum, with Professor Akhil Amar explaining, students need to see how legal precision can cut through political spin. Crockett's technique, specific questions, exact citations, refusing deflection, is what we try to teach in every advocacy course. The international legal community took notice as well. Constitutional law professors in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom began using the clip in their courses about American federalism. The University of Oxford's American Studies program invited Crockett to speak about the role of legal expertise in democratic governance. Media critics analyzed why the exchange was so uniquely effective compared to typical political debates. Unlike the usual cable news format of competing talking points and strategic deflection, Crockett had treated the segment like a legal argument, demanding specificity and refusing to accept unsupported claims about constitutional law. Washington Post media critic Margaret Sullivan wrote, "This exchange demonstrates what political journalism could be if we demanded the same precision from politicians that we expect from lawyers in courtrooms." Crockett showed that expertise matters and that public officials should be held accountable for their understanding of the laws they implement. The New York Times editorial board used the moment to call for higher standards in political discourse. When governors claim constitutional authority, they should be prepared to defend those claims with the same rigor required in federal court. Representative Crockett demonstrated why legal precision matters in governance. Even international media coverage emphasized the educational value of the exchange. The BBC's analysis focused on how the moment illustrated broader problems with constitutional literacy among American politicians. The Guardian's constitutional law correspondent wrote, Crockett's systematic demolition of Sanders' arguments revealed a troubling gap between political rhetoric and legal reality in American governance. The long-term political damage to Sanders became more apparent with each passing week. Her approval ratings in Arkansas didn't just drop among college-educated voters. They plummeted among anyone who watched the clip and understood the magnitude of her constitutional ignorance. Local Arkansas newspapers began running editorials questioning whether their governor understood the basic legal principles underlying her own policies. More significantly, her national political ambitions suffered what many observers considered a fatal blow. Republican primary voters in early 2028 polling consistently ranked constitutional knowledge as crucial for presidential candidates. Sanders found herself having to explain her legal understanding in ways that constantly reminded voters of her televised humiliation. The Arkansas Republican Party privately began discussing whether they needed to find a new standard-bearer for national politics. Internal polling showed that even among conservative voters, Sanders' constitutional credibility had been permanently damaged by her inability to defend basic legal principles on national television. Conservative donors who had been courting Sanders for a potential presidential run quietly began redirecting their attention to other potential candidates. As one major GOP fundraiser told Politico, "You can't run for president when there's a viral clip of you being completely destroyed on constitutional law. That's not a political problem. That's a disqualifying character flaw." Arkansas taxpayers, as Crockett had predicted, ended up paying millions in legal fees as federal courts struck down the unconstitutional legislation. The state was forced to settle multiple civil rights lawsuits, with plaintiffs' attorneys specifically citing Sanders' admissions during the CNN segment. Perhaps most significantly, the exchange changed how political media approached constitutional debates. Producers began booking actual legal experts instead of relying solely on political figures to discuss complex legal issues. For Jasmine Crockett, the moment marked her emergence as a national political figure. But unlike typical viral political moments that fade quickly, this one had lasting substance because it was grounded in legal expertise rather than political theater. The lesson was clear. In an era of political polarization, actual expertise still matters. When politicians make claims about constitutional law, they'd better be prepared to defend them against people who actually understand the Constitution. Months later, when asked about the moment, Crockett would tell law students, "The Constitution isn't a political document you can interpret however you want. It's law, and if you're going to claim constitutional authority, you better understand what you're talking about." Sarah Huckabee Sanders, meanwhile, quietly hired new legal advisors and avoided constitutional topics in subsequent media appearances. The confident governor who'd entered that CNN studio had learned a hard lesson about the difference between political rhetoric and legal reality. The viral moment became a case study in why expertise matters in governance and why voters should demand that their elected officials actually understand the laws they're sworn to uphold. If you enjoyed watching Jasmine Crockett deliver this constitutional masterclass, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible political moments. What did you think of this legal takedown? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss when we break down the latest political drama. Who do you think will be the next politician to get schooled on constitutional law? Let us know your predictions.